Welcome to Puget Sound Garden Life. My name's Allison, and this is my home garden where we live just south of Seattle in Washington State, Garden Zone 8B. It's been a long time since I've done a garden tour, and there's been a ton of growth. So I'm so excited to share with you what's growing here in our home garden and some things that I've learned this year and some things that I plan on doing to grow my fall garden. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you really enjoy this tour. It's time to take a peek at what's growing in my jungle. This area has turned out so much more voluptuous, I guess for lack of a better word, than I expected, and I'm so excited about it. I will say that these sunflowers are shading out a lot of this over here, so the tomatoes are taking a little bit longer to ripen up, but it's so gorgeous. I could not pull these when they were starting because I was so excited to have them volunteer over there. These are giant mammoth sunflowers that I planted from seed and intermixed in this wall for the next two sections are tomatoes, sunflowers, and beans, which you can't see because it really didn't work out. So at the base here I did plant some purple pole beans and rattlesnake beans, but you can see the germination was super poor. There's just not enough light and space in here because of the overcrowding from the tomatoes, and I'm okay with that. It was a test, and now I know that I need to have a dedicated space for my green beans. I just really wanted a lot of tomatoes this year. So at the base of the tomatoes, I also have things growing here. The marigolds are just a companion plant and a flower to look nice. There's different types of basil that are in here. This is a Thai basil, and next to that is a early bell. These have some flowers. They had some flowers, but now they're really tiny buds on here. So it's not, the plant itself is looking okay, but it doesn't have a lot of flowers. Next to that is a Better Bell California Wonder Bell pepper, and it already has some fruit on it, so that's really good to see. And it looks like it might have a few aphids, or that could be some granulated fertilizer that I put on it the other night. I put down granulated fertilizer, and it was like 9 o'clock at night, and I couldn't really see what I was doing, so some of the things might have got sprinkled with a little fertilizer. Okay, back to the tomatoes. My favorite tomato, and I bought this out as a start this year, is a Sun Gold tomato. This plant is doing so well. I let it have this one has about 4 main stems. It's been so hard to keep up on the suckers, and I've had a lot of additional main stems. Originally I was planning on having about 3 main stems per plant, but most of my plants have probably about 5 main stems, and they are reaching the top of this trellis. I'm 5'8", so this trellis is probably about 6.5, 7 feet up here. So they're getting pretty tall, and they're starting to develop fruit at the top. Next to the Sun Gold plant is an early girl. This I also grew from a start, and it has some nice fruit on it. It's taken its time to ripen up. There's probably about 10 fruits down here, but it hasn't really developed any fruit past this point yet. It does have some flowers, so I'm hoping that those will develop fruits in a few weeks here. Moving on to the next tomato, I have got a San Marzano, and I really wanted to do some tomatoes for sauces this year, so I grew this San Marzano and some other Romas, and it's doing okay. I don't see any fruits on it yet, but it does have a lot of flowers. Next to that is a super steak beef steak tomato. My husband really prefers large slicing tomatoes. I prefer grape, pear, smaller things, mostly because I don't like the texture of large tomatoes, but also they're a lot easier to grow than a large slicing tomato. But this super steak has some fruits on it. Right down here, there's 4 fruits at this spot. And it doesn't have any fruits above this, but it does have some flowers. I'm not sure if these set fruit or not. Not all of my flowers are setting fruit. Need to do some more research about why that might be happening. Okay, this plant here is a yellow pear, and it has a few fruits on it, but a lot of these flowers did not develop fruit. But higher up, some of the flowers are starting to develop fruits. There are a ton of flowers on it, so I'm really hoping that these will mature into delicious fruits. The next tomato is the first of the tomatoes that I grew from seed. This was actually my first year growing tomatoes from seed. These are just a plain red cherry, and they're doing really well. I'm super excited for them to mature and develop. The next about 4 or 5 plants are also the same variety. I've been pruning the heck out of these tomatoes, and they're still growing like crazy. I've had to do a lot of tying up to keep them tied onto the trellis. Otherwise, they would just all be here in this row, and you wouldn't be able to walk through here, and I already struggle with that anyways. So a lot of my time is spent pruning and trellising these tomatoes. The beans in this bed are a slight bit more successful, but I really don't anticipate a huge harvest out of all of these pole beans. But that's okay. I've got a lot of bush beans that will help stock our freezer. One thing I'm really loving about this bed and this trellis is all of the wildflowers that are growing behind it. So up above us in that trellis is the cottage garden that's full of, oh, take a look at our squirrel. There he goes. I hope he enjoys those strawberries. So up here in the cottage garden, a lot of perennials and reseeding annuals, our blueberry bushes that the birds just love to come and take, and it's a really beautiful space. I can also get up there and harvest tomatoes that are up in that area that I can't reach from here. All right, here's where we're getting a little bit crowded. So I'm gonna finish showing you all the tomatoes, and then we're gonna come back and talk about all this stuff that's growing on this side. Down at the base of the tomatoes down here, I do have more peppers that I grew from seed, and I've learned that I need to treat my peppers a lot more like tomatoes when growing them from seed, and I just need to start them sooner and plant them up into larger containers instead of the 6-cell pack that I did. These are more Walla Walla sweet onions that I planted as starts that I grew from seed. They haven't even started bulbing yet. Most likely because this tomatillo is here shading them out, but that's all right. They'll get there eventually, I'm hoping. Okay, so through this jungle here, you can see there's beans growing in here. These cherry tomatoes are just going crazy. I can't wait to harvest those and dehydrate them. That's one of the ways that I like to save them, is pop them in my dehydrator and then freeze them. Then this next section is all Roma tomatoes. I didn't realize that they were going to be a determinate tomato. So knowing that, and if I want to grow Romas in the future, I'm going to plant them up in that north terrace because our trellises are shorter and it would be a better place for them so that I could utilize this. But you can see that the beans are happy. So since these tomatoes are shorter, the beans have really been able to pop up and start growing. So hopefully here we'll get a good section of beans. I actually didn't realize how well they were doing, so seeing that for the first time is cool. Roma tomatoes, so these are a determinate. I have not pruned them. I've only pruned them at the bottom to keep their leaves off the soil. So a determinate tomato is going to grow to a predetermined size. It's going to set its fruit, and then it won't continue growing after it sets its fruit, and it will set fruit for throughout the summer, but most of its fruit comes on at the same time. So it's important not to prune all of your suckers and things off of your determinates because they won't keep growing, and you just want it to grow and produce as many flowers and fruits as you can. Whereas the cherry tomatoes and all the other tomatoes, except for that San Marzano, that I showed you, those are all indeterminate, so they just keep growing and growing until a frost or cold weather kills them off. Oh boy, I just haven't been in here in a day, and just seeing all this growth is really excited. I don't see any fruits on these tomatoes, but I do see a lot of flowers, so that's great. All right, this is the last 12-foot bed over in this area, and looks like I got a little crazy with the sunflowers because they're taking over. There's 4 plants in here, and that's after I had a couple die. There are also beans growing in this bed. I basically put beans in all of these beds. These are Kentucky Wonder pole beans, and they are growing up around that sunflower. Looks like they're feeling pretty happy about it. And there are a lot more down here that just haven't flushed out this area yet because I planted these a lot later than the others. Down below, I've got some basil, and there are some, right on this front corner is another yellow squash because I went a little yellow squash crazy. And I might remove that. We'll see. There's also mini pumpkins behind here. I'm growing these mini pumpkins at the community garden too, and they're just not quite the trellising pumpkin that I thought they would be. Their vines are pretty short and they're pretty bushy, and they're taking a long time to really shoot those vines out. So I'm hoping it will. Oh, actually that's a buttercup squash. Just kidding. The next ones down are the mini pumpkins. There's just so much in here. So that buttercup is starting to vine up there. The mini pumpkins, let's see if my beans get out of the way here. Okay, so there's a mini pumpkin here, which hasn't really set a long runner yet, so it's not climbing much. And it just so happens there's a million beans in the way. And the beans are needing some assistance getting onto this trellis. I find that if you plant the seed in the perfect spot on your trellis, it grows so much quicker because it just, once it touches that trellis, it just takes off. Whereas if it's not at the good spot on your trellis, it's just gonna take a little bit more time and not grow as fast. So I make sure I get in there and try to tuck them into the trellis to get them going. So here's a mini pumpkin right here. It is starting to climb, so I want to make sure that I get it tucked in behind that trellis. I will admit this area is probably a little bit overplanted, but I really don't mind overplanting because I want to test the limits of how much food we can grow in here. And once the season goes through and I can see how much we've harvested, then I know for next year what I should do differently. There's more basil, and at this end, this is kind of my cold weather greens. This area stays a lot more shaded. This is Lacinato kale that I've been harvesting quite a bit from. I took out most of the leaves from this plant. I think I might just take the whole plant out to really get some air in here because there's a little bit of fungus growing on this leaf right there. So we want to make sure that we don't have any of that. One thing that I've learned in trying to maximize how much you're growing in a very small space, like raised beds or these terraces where it's just a really narrow space, is to make sure I remove dead foliage as often as possible. And I'm not shy and I'm not worried about plants losing their leaves because they're producing new leaves, and this isn't going to be providing and photosynthesizing for the plant anyways. So that's a tip that's really helpful for me. So that was the half of this area that's up against the trellis. Now we have the half that is in the raised mounded bed, and that trellises over this retaining wall. These giant beasts are my Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are a really long season crop, about 110 days, whereas something like a zucchini or bush beans could be anywhere from 50 to 75 days for maturity. So these I planted early in April, and they should be ready to harvest in maybe the next 4 weeks. They're starting to develop their buds of where the Brussels sprouts will form, but they have not really developed into a little floret yet. There are 6 Brussels sprouts plants in here, and it is very packed. I've been trimming leaves once they start yellowing. So down here you can see this yellow leaf. I'm gonna pull that off. I've been trimming those, getting them out of here. I've been making sure that the cabbage moth larvae are not in here eating. I've been spraying them occasionally with neem oil to make sure the aphids aren't a problem. So that's another thing when trying to maximize your harvest, is you got to be really on top of any pest pressure. So that really helps make sure that there's not a problem hiding underneath there that I don't see. Interspersed with the Brussels sprouts are spaghetti squash. You can kind of see some of the flowers and the leaves, and I am super excited of how well they're growing when they're interplanted like this. The plants themselves are trailing over the side of the retaining wall, which we will take a look at once we finish the tour of this bed. It turned out beautifully, and I'm just super pleased with it. Once these are done, I will plant something for the fall garden here, and I'll need to make sure I amend my soil because these Brussels sprouts are really heavy feeders, and to make sure they're successful, my next crop is successful, I'll want to amend the soil. The bees are out right now having a great time. Okay, so another crop that's the first for me this year are these tomatillos. I planted 6 plants. Actually, no, I planted 7. I grew 6 from seed, purple tomatillos, and then felt the need to buy another one at the store as a start. Well, I did a little research after I planted them, and it turns out that these plants are a lot more gigantic than I thought they would be. Their structure is similar to tomatoes in that they need to be supported, and I didn't have any of these supported, so luckily I did my research soon enough in the spring where I could still get some tomato cages on these. So these ones are supported by tomato cages. I removed 3 other plants that were just taking up too much space in the spaghetti squash, and because this will provide plenty of tomatillos, and I really love squash, and I love them so much that I didn't care about the tomatillos. So next year I might plant less of these. We'll see how much we enjoy having the tomatillos as a crop. Oh, look at this little buggy. Not sure what it is, but I thought that red was pretty cool. Okay, everybody, these bush beans have really surprised me. Last year I grew a Ferrari bush bean by Botanical Interest, and I loved them. They were so tender. The plants were nice and compact. They grew perfectly for what I needed out of the bush bean. These are Royal Burgundy bush beans, and I have never grown them, and they are so different than the Ferrari bush beans I planted last year. I almost thought that they were pole beans by the way they were growing. These are about twice the height, if not 2.5 times the height of the Ferrari beans I grew last year, and they're just a very, very bushy plant. So I was really worried that I had accidentally planted some pole beans instead of bush beans, because we all know that happens sometimes. But they're doing great. Their flowers started setting. There's beans all over these. I actually snacked on a bean yesterday. It was delicious. I came through and thinned out some of the lower leaves of these plants a few days ago because they were touching the ground, they were yellowing. Here's an example. So the leaves that I thinned out looked like this, and I think it really helped kind of air everything out, and I'm hoping it will help the fruit set for the beans. I'm just so excited to harvest all these. I'm not sure if I would plant these again. We'll see how we enjoy the beans, and knowing ahead of time how bushy they get, I wouldn't space them as close together as I did my Ferrari bush beans. These will be finished here in a couple of weeks, and I will be using this space to plant either more beans, but most likely I'll probably put some fall brassicas in this space. The sun is starting to shine on these beautiful sunflowers, I thought these were going to be mammoth sunflowers, but they're not really developing that large head. However, the plant is a mammoth large. These ones are also supposed to be mammoth sunflowers, but the heads aren't super gigantic. I'm wondering if the heads will start to be larger on flowers that develop a little bit later. I'm going to take you on a tour of the front part of this bed because it's beautiful. Here's another example of leaves that I remove these from the sunflower just to make sure that I'm not breeding any disease in there. I actually just toss my leaves down in this gravel area and then I come and do a cleanup every couple of days. Tucked into the spaces between these retaining wall bricks, I have some blue spice basil. It is the best smelling basil ever. It is a sweet vanilla, almost like a vanilla pineapple scent. It is so good. Just love to come in here and fluff it, and that scent really fills the air. I've already harvested some and muddled it with some fresh orange juice, blended it up and froze little ice cubes of fresh squeezed orange juice, blended with that, and popped those in a little adult drink. They're fabulous. So as you can see, it's going to be super easy to harvest these bush beans. Even though I wish we had a flat yard, one cool thing about having these terrace garden beds is that I can just walk up and harvest things and take care of my garden at garden level. So here's one of my Royal Burgundy bush beans, and you can even eat these raw out of the garden. They are delicious. I should probably stop doing that so we can save some to harvest. Okay, here's my pride and joy. These are my spaghetti squash. I don't know the variety. I've been saving them from seed for a few years. So they are trellising down off the wall, and then these runners were starting to cross the path here, and I still hand water all this with a hose. So pulling a hose down here to try to water this back end with those beets that are like never going to take off was getting really tough, and it was going to start damaging the plants. So I tied them up here, and I'm making a little garland for them, and I'm hoping that it will set some more fruit. Here's a fruit here. This is a great example of a fruit that did not get pollinated. So the shriveled up, I touched it and it fell off. So if you're having a lot of these and nothing's getting pollinated, you should try to get out there and do some hand pollinating just to make sure your fruits are getting pollinated. That one will be for the squirrels. Okay, so one thing that I've really been changing my mindset about, I shouldn't say changing my mindset, but developing a new mindset about why I love gardening so much, is that it's like an art to me. It's envisioning what things will look like once they are fully grown and developing their fruit. And this space is one of those examples of it being just a giant art project for me. Here is just what I dreamt that this would look like. The squash is vining right down this beautiful ladder. I've got one growing right there. There's a few fruits right there. It's so beautiful. So the area we just toured was my south terrace, which is right where the cameraman / my wonderful husband Bill is standing. And it faces out to this terrace, which is my north terrace behind me. Look at all these nasturtiums. They are gorgeous. I planted these as seeds in April. A few of them I planted as starts, the ones that are over here just cascading down this retaining wall. I'm so pleased at how they turned out because I really wanted to soften up the stone retaining wall and give this more of a cozy, natural, soft feeling. And these have really done the trick. So I will definitely continue doing this in the future, but also try some other flowers that might look nice cascading over that wall. So we're gonna be walking around to the north terrace garden, and I'm gonna give you a tour of what's in there. Come along. So I'm gonna start off right here with this in-ground bed. This bed, I added garden soil on top of the soil that was used to make these retaining walls. And this is where I had my spring garden with broccoli, cauliflower, kohlrabi, and I still have the onions that I had in earlier. I also grew some bok choy, but that wasn't successful. It ended up bolting. What I want to show you first is this early prolific yellow squash. This plant looks horrible. It's in such bad condition, but it has been pumping out the yellow squash. In fact, I need to harvest these. They have been delicious and really prolific, as the name says. But as you look super close to the plant, you're going to see that something is wrong with this main stem. So I'm thinking that a bug has been in there eating it, or maybe there's some sort of bacterial or fungal infection in there, but the plant is still producing. I'm really surprised that there's barely any leaves, but there's so much fruit. So, oh, looks like we even have some aphids or something. I don't think they're aphids. I'm not sure what they are. Maybe they're aphids. But something's been attacking this, and I'm actually going to be removing this bush soon because I have other yellow squash that we'll be enjoying that are just starting to fruit. And then here I'm going to put in a broccoli plant when it's time. This right here is one empty vegetable bed for the middle of July. Yesterday I just pulled out all of the beets that were in here. Earlier this spring this was full of sugar snap peas, and those finished out. Now what I have planted here is a weedy little pumpkin, a patty pan squash, some butternut squash. So I'm hoping that these will trellis up here, and I haven't quite decided what I'm going to put in front of them, but I will be putting in some sort of fall crop right there. So I'm actually going to be leaving this bed empty for a while. I'm going to show you a video of when we removed those beets yesterday and some information about how growing those beets went this year. This bed here is where I grew our squirrel jumping through the tree. This bed here is where I grew our sugar snap peas earlier this spring. This whole 11-foot bed was just covered in peas, and I succession planted them throughout the spring to keep continuing a nice crop. But then when I planted those peas, I also planted 2 rows of beets, thinking that I could squeeze in peas, beets in about a 2-foot space. But that was just way too much. So the peas did amazing, but they just really fluffed out a ton and totally choked out that middle row of beets. And they even really pushed out a lot on the front row of beets. So these beets just did not do well. I ended up removing a lot of the beets in that middle row just because they had bolted already and weren't maturing, or just failed to thrive as little seedlings. So if you want to come take a look, these beets here are what we would call have bolted. So this right here is starting to flower and go to seed, and so it's signaling to the plant that the life of the plant is over and it's not going to be producing as much fruit in the root. It also makes the beet root itself a lot woodier and more chewy, and it's not as tender and delicious to eat. So these beets were kind of a failure, but not a complete failure, because I have a lot of beets in here that I'm gonna harvest. So I also in this bed put some radishes, but they were in this front row and had beets in the back. So what I would do next year, I would still do peas and beets in the front, but put a row of radishes in the middle, because those, the lifespan on those, they would sprout and come to harvest before the peas got too big and before the beets got too big, and that would just give some more space in here. And I'm thinking that would probably be enough space for the beets to be successful. So that's something I'm going to try differently next year, or maybe even this fall. So obviously these need a lot more light. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to harvest all of these beets, and then I'm going to show you what this looks like once these are all cleared out and given all those squashes some more light. So in here I've already harvested a few beets, and I will get a decent little beet crop out of this. Just kind of wanted to show you what it looks like when you have a mature beet. And these ones, you can see the crown of the beet or the shoulders of the beet sticking out of the soil. So we will have some roasted beets in our future. This bed is all been cleaned out of those beets and just has some pumpkins, butternut squash, and a patty pan squash left in it. It's so weird to have an empty garden bed in the middle of July, but these squash really needed to have some more space and sunlight and air to grow, and I'll be planting some fall crops in here. Haven't decided which exact fall crops I'll plant in here. Probably some carrots and some radishes, but I haven't settled exactly what I'm gonna do yet. But for sure I'm gonna be waiting a few weeks to plant, well, at least probably a month to plant them out here, so that I'm not planting those cold weather crops in the middle of this heat. Here's my little butternut squash seedlings. These I germinated in the oven with my oven light on. Did great for them. This is the butternut squash that I purchased when we were on vacation in Lake Chelan. I just couldn't resist buying it because I was looking for starts for quite a while. And then I've got a couple more butternut squash seedlings. Next up, we're going to take a look at this beautiful bed of carrots, cucumbers, and salvia. There's also one little random dill that I seeded in here. So again, here's an example of how I overplanted. In the spring, I did 2 rows of carrots. So there's one row, the second row, and then had the cucumbers at the back. And interspersed with the cucumbers, I planted this salvia. This is my first time ever growing salvia, and I didn't realize this variety was gonna be so bushy. So those are also really crowding out those cucumbers as well. The cucumbers are really starting to take off. I would tell you all the varieties, but I forgot to label a lot of them when I planted them, which is something I'm learning as a gardener that is really important and trying to get better at that. So they are starting to flower and fill in with fruits. But what we're gonna do right now is I'm gonna harvest all of these carrots. They've been in there for plenty of time, and they're either going to be good or they're not going to be good, but they are getting out of the way to make more space for these cucumbers. I really wish that my kids were with me to help harvest these carrots because they really love that job, but Bill and I are pretty lucky. They're having a slumber party at Grandma and Grandpa's last night, so we're out here getting all these chores done. Here's our carrot haul. I'm actually surprised that these carrots are a lot more mature than I thought they would be. I didn't want to give them any more time just because I needed the air and the space for my cucumbers and salvia here. So I'm pretty happy with this carrot harvest. It's actually one of the best carrot harvests I've had, and now I just know what varieties grow best in my garden, and I'll focus on that. But make sure that you label them, because I'm actually not sure which variety this one is, but I do know that these rainbow carrots did not do very well in my garden. Down here in my mounded raised bed, there are green beans that have been attacked by the slugs. Oh my, something even dug. So not just slugs, because this one got dug up by something. I'm not sure what's going there. We do have some neighborhood bunnies, and there are some squirrels that love to use our fence as a racetrack. And I know that they've been in here because I find the holes of my strawberries in little piles all over the place. So they love to eat these strawberries, and I'm okay with sharing them right now. In this bed here, I also have butternut squash. I don't know the variety name because I've been seed saving this for a few years. But as you can see, it's really slow to take off and very compact. It takes a long time, or last summer it took a long time for it to really start vining out, but it did eventually get there. But I don't think I'm going to grow that variety next year. I'm going to try something new. Throughout this bed, I have some delicata squash, acorn squash, my Walla Walla sweet onions that I planted as a pairing with my broccoli in the spring. These are snapdragons I grew from seed, zinnias that I planted from the store that need to be deadheaded. They're not doing so well. But garden maintenance includes deadheading, and things don't always look well. I hope you enjoyed this garden tour. I am so excited to show off how beautiful it is back here. I really wish that there wasn't a pandemic right now and I could have some people over to my house for a garden party and some drinks and a meal. So this is the next best thing, is being able to share it with you guys through video. And I am really excited for how beautifully things are turned out. And next steps are going to be getting my fall garden planted. I'm actually going to be planting some seeds today under my grow lights. It's a little too hot outside to plant them in the garden, so I'm going to be planting them inside. And as the weather cools down, I'll bring them outside and start filling in spaces where all these crops have already been harvested. Hope you have a wonderful day, and it really means a lot to me that you took the time to watch this video. If you have any questions or if you'd like to see anything in particular, I would love to hear about it and appreciate your support and encouragement. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, feel free to click this subscribe button wherever in the world it's pointing on this screen, and then you'll be getting notifications for videos that I make in the future. Hope you have a great day.